Welcome to Postwave.
You're here with Eric and Trevor. Today we're talking about free will.
We're going to be talking about whether volition exists, whether free will exists, and how that's tied to whether the universe is deterministic or indeterministic, and whether every possibility exists, and also how this all relates to moral responsibility. Let's start with your definition of free will.
Yeah, so to me, what free will speaks to is the ability to make decisions and to act upon them.
Okay. So a decision that takes input from your environment that you're like deliberating on, kind of, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter for you whether it's like something you think about for a long time and like change your mind back and forth, or whether it's something that you immediately, like, the answer comes into your head and you just do that thing.
Yeah, I don't think there's a distinction there.
Mm-hmm. So that's definitely like a valid definition. Like some people would give that as all that free will is. But I think there's something deeper about your decisions couldn't have been otherwise.
So I guess this comes to our point of contention then.
Yeah.
So speak a little bit more about that, if you would.
So when you're making a decision, it seems like you can choose one thing or the other, and after you make the decision, it seems like you totally could have just as easily gone the other way, right? Especially if it's something trivial, like which flavor of ice cream you want to have or something. And you might even like regret your decision.
Alas, pistachio.
But I don't think that's really the case. Because the decision you made was totally dependent on your brain state before you made the decision, which itself was dependent on the inputs to all your senses and the state of your brain prior to you making that decision. And whether the brain functions according to determinism or not, I don't think it really makes sense to say that you could have chosen differently.
How does that track? I know there's a lot of woo-woo about quantum mechanics means free will, but
so I think even if it's random, some people will say that the quantum mechanics leaves open the door for free will, and I think it's definitely possible, at least a little bit. But if it was truly random, I don't think that's the same sense that people think of free will in most of the time. Because if you imagine your decision was just based on like a random number generator, I don't think that would square with what people think of as free will.
Okay.
And maybe that's what's creating the illusion, but I don't think it's the same thing.
Yeah, this is interesting. Let's talk about this. I think this is a language that we can agree on, in that as I see the world, there's definitely certain constants about our existence that, even though we might want them to be otherwise, have to be that way. That the world should be imperfect, that it should be broken. So it seems to me that in order for anything to exist at all, there has to be the possibility for anything at all to exist.
See, that seems like it's just saying the same thing twice to me.
No, it's clever because I mixed up the word order. Yeah, no. So if you want a particular world state to exist, you have to open the doors for any possible world state to exist.
Okay. I don't know if I necessarily believe that. I mean, it kind of connects to the whole many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. That every if the universe is truly infinite and quantum mechanics works the way we think it does, then everything that it can happen will happen.
Well, to me, this is something that is absolutely true, and I hope I can communicate how. Although this is a tricky thing, that in order for a particular world state to exist, that we have to open up the possibility for anything to exist. And I think what it comes down to is that there's a particular... I think what it comes down to is that it's, again, if things are to exist, where did they come from?
Yeah, that's a big question. Yeah.
Would you accept that at some point something had to come from nothing?
Well, it's either that or it's that our concept of nothing doesn't really map onto reality. Like we have this idea because the world we see around us makes us think that there, or just the way our brain works at least, makes us think that there is such a thing as nothing. That's like a meaningful concept that maps onto reality, but I don't think that's necessarily true. And it
let's explore that.
Yeah, so I mean, I at least remember in A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, he talks about how the universe could have not had a beginning, and it's just always existed. And I mean, it's kind of hard to square with the Big Bang, I guess, but especially if the multiverse theory is true, and it's been a bunch of different Big Bangs happening for eternity, and that could make sense.
Yeah, I would buy that interpretation, but at the same time, I think there is value in the concept of an origin, even if it's not the end-all be-all origin, but just an origin. Where did something come from? Let's say it's a particular something. Let's say it's you. Let's say it's Trevor we're talking about. Where did Trevor come from? And if you go back far enough, you have to say that Trevor came out of nothing.
But why? Because, you mean, if you go back all the way to the beginning of the universe, or if you go back to...
Sure, yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, I still don't think that's... I mean, I agree it's possible. I don't agree that it's necessarily true.
Yeah. I'm struggling to understand how that stance fits in to the discussion.
Yeah. So how do you see that relating to free will?
Hang on, we kind of got derailed a couple times. Yeah, because what I was trying to demonstrate was that how the world must necessarily be open to any form of existence, as opposed to simply one desired existence. Because, okay, we'll take it a different tack. So here's a question. You can imagine that there is a particular world state that is the best, or at least it's ideal for everyone. It's the most beneficial sort of situation. Can you imagine such a thing?
Yeah, sure.
So, if such a possible world state could exist, why does it not exist right now?
Because it's very unlikely, and we're we're not in the branch of the quantum wave function where that exists. And also, it's unlikely, and it's also unstable, because if you're saying that everyone has maximized their well-being, I think just due to the chaotic nature of the universe, that situation won't stick around for that long.
Hmm. Interesting. Chaotic nature. So that does tie into what I'm talking about, but I don't necessarily buy that it would have to be unstable. I think that if you have all of existence working towards this goal, then there would be no external force to take it away from that goal. It's only the playing of existence against existence that creates the effect of um, of chaos, of deviating from that order.
Huh. It's only existence playing against existence that creates the chaos.
Yeah, because you said that there's some mystical force of chaos, of uh, heat death or whatever, that causes an ordered state to go from ordered to being disordered, right?
Right.
But I would posit that there is no such mystical force, that that is only result of the way things are already chaotically interacting. But that if you achieved a synchronicity of all of existence working together towards a particular goal, then there is no other force that could get in the way of that.
Isn't that kind of like a perpetual motion machine?
Only in the sense that the universe is like a perpetual motion machine.
But I mean, it's not. That's what the heat death of the universe is when the perpetual motion machine stops.
Is there? So let's talk about this heat death thing. Is there like a particular arbitrary cutoff after which point you can say it has died, or is it just that it continually expands and approaches lesser and lesser temperatures?
I mean, at some point it gets to absolute zero, and it's kind of like an asymptotic thing. Let me look
Does
it up.
Does it actually reach absolute zero, or does it just approach it? Because I thought absolute zero was impossible.
Yeah, let's see. I mean, I know one of the last things that happens is proton decay,
Mm-hmm.
and that happens after some ridiculous number of years. And then I think before that it's like black holes evaporate. Yeah, I mean, there's conflicting theories, but this says, after the evaporation of all baryons, the resulting bath of zero-frequency photons, indistinguishable from empty space, will condense into new protons, each miles across, which will undergo another 13.8 billion year-long exponentially accelerating shrinkage and evaporation, and so ad infinitum. Mm-hmm. So maybe you do have kind of a point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Anyway, that's again an aside. So what I was saying was that for there to be any existence at all, there has to be the possibility of any possible existence. To me, this is another way of saying that existence is confined to a chaos pattern of random things happening.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this hypothetical situation where this is the way the world we want should be, right? This is we have a hypothetical best state world.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the world that we have right now. And so then again, the question is, why do we not have the world that we want? Why do we have this imperfect world?
Because like I said, it's very unlikely, and
why?
because there's a lot more ways for it to be imperfect than for it to be perfect.
Yeah, and I agree. But why? Why do we have to have one of the imperfect ones? Shouldn't we be able to immediately, upon existing, recognize the best possible world and then achieve that and then live in that?
We could do that if we had free will.
We could do that if we had volition.
How do you distinguish volition from free will?
This comes down to the ability to make decisions. In a previous discussion, we were talking and we sort of agreed on this point that, yeah, okay, you can make decisions, but you can't decide what it is that you want.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still hold by that stance?
Yeah.
Cool. So if you have volition, that just means that you can make decisions. So let's say there's random existence that takes the form of us existing, and we recognize that our existence is misaligned with the best scenario.
Mm-hmm.
We have no free will to say that we want something else. We see that there's only this one thing that we can want, and so we take steps to achieve that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that all makes sense. So that's volition.
Yeah.
No, I agree with that. I just wouldn't call that free will.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, totally. So, but what all I'm trying to get at right now is that there has to be the state we're in right now that is imperfect.
Yeah. I mean, there there has to be the state that we're in right now. Period. Right.
Yeah, and as we look at that state and see how it varies from the perfect possibility that we want, then we know that in order for some form of existence to exist, then any form of existence must be able to exist as well. Because why would we be in this state as it is not the desired state?
I guess I see what you're getting at. I guess my question is also like perfect according to who?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a good point, because the world is made up of a lot of different entities, so it seems, that have different goals and desires.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think is that the difference in desires can only arise as those entities fail to recognize that all of the other entities are part of itself.
Mm-hmm. You said fail to recognize that they're part of itself?
Yeah, because, okay, let's say you have Bob and Jane in a closed room, and they both want to live, and there's 18 sandwiches. And there's no way to get out of the room, and they both just want to live as long as they can. So Bob could kill Jane and then eat all sandwiches. Or Bob could recognize that Jane is also a living entity made of the same conscious stuff as he is, and that her existence has value as much as his own, and then they could share the sandwiches and live a little bit shorter time.
I mean, if they're already killing the other person, then they can revert to cannibalism and live even longer. So I feel like you have to.
That's a good point. Actually, that was a really terrible analogy that I put together. Yeah, there's a better way to put that. Okay, let's say you are on a train track, and there's a trolley, and it's headed for 5 people, and you're on the other train track, and you're tied down, but you happen to be within the reach of the lever that'll turn it onto your track. Now, if you recognize the value of those other people as being the same as your own, then you'll pull that lever, and the world will have greater amount of value.
But meanwhile, your evolutionary drive for self-preservation is screaming at you that you don't pull the lever. And I think, given that every living being on Earth has that drive, really strong drive within them, and that almost no one, especially animals, don't have the like willpower to overcome that. Like what about all the like carnivores that would die because they couldn't eat the like their prey?
All that's right, but I think you totally missed my point.
I accept. I mean, if you're like utilitarian, there is some state of the world that would like maximize general well-being. Okay, so how does this all tie back to free will?
Okay, so let me just lay it out without any derailings, without any but maybe that's not true. And I'll just put it together. You can pick it apart afterwards. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. For anything to exist, it's necessary for any possibility to exist. This is because you can imagine a world state that is desirable, that is more desirable than the current world state, and that is attainable. And if you look at the present moment and say, why do we not have the perfect reality, you must realize that, it's because things just happened that made it so that we are in the current place that we are. And those things happened before there was any sort of conscious, concerted drive toward achieving that goal. Like you were saying, it's infinitely improbable that the best world just happens first. It's much more probable that things will just happen, and they aren't going to be the most desirable situation right off the bat. And so what this says to me is that there are certain patterns that are unavoidable to existence, certain undeniable facts about the way existence, the forms that existence takes. And to me, that pattern is clearly that of a chaos pattern. It is a thing that appears to be random. It's just random things happening that eventually coalesce into patterns which then can make decisions. And in this sense, I agree with your statement that there is no free will.
Right, because it necessarily has to strive towards this perfect state.
Yeah, and that it necessarily has to include the imperfect state.
Right. Okay, so, but you still think there's free will?
Yeah, because for me that language only speaks to volition as opposed to the ability to choose what you desire.
Okay, so now that we I think we kind of settled that whole thing. So how about this ability to choose what you desire thing? Because that seems to be like the sticking point.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I don't think that's a sticking point. I think that's where we agree. That I don't believe that you can necessarily choose what you desire. I think you've swayed me on this point since our last discussion.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because of what I've just delineated, I feel like if you could choose what you desire, then that situation that I just set up wouldn't work, because you could pursue alternate world states and you wouldn't be forced towards that particular one. So you could say the world state that we have right now is the perfect world state that I want, and it just happened that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, cool. So what do we disagree about then?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we may have ironed it out. However, I still disagree with the language of saying there is no such thing as free will, or saying that there is this proof against free will. Because to me, free will, as I've said, it speaks only to volition, but I think it's important to recognize that that term, for a lot of people, what's important about that term is the ability to differentiate actions in a hierarchy of desirable versus non-desirable actions. Now, if you say there is no free will, what that means to most people is no action you make has any consequence one way or the other, because you don't matter and nothing you do matters.
I mean, I don't. People might get that impression, but I don't think it makes sense to say that actions don't have consequences. I think it means that all this like mental effort and kind of hemming and hawing over your decisions, and the resulting anxiety and just kind of mental anguish isn't really justified, because in the end you're going to make whatever decision you make.
Interesting. To me, that is a really valuable takeaway, but to me that's also kind of a different issue. I have seen the folly of trying to wish that what you chose was better. Like, to me, it is 100% useless to think about what could have been for past decisions. And I've seen people who beat themselves up and destroy themselves over wishing they had done something different, even without recognizing that they couldn't have chosen differently because they weren't privy to certain information. And that the decision they made, even though it turned out badly for them, was still the best decision they could have made.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, I think, but I mean, you do need to. I mean, considering what's called the counterfactual, which is this idea of you could have done something differently, or something different could have happened. like that is important for when you encounter similar situations in the future,
Sure.
right?
Certainly.
But and sometimes if you keep if you keep returning to the same thing, your idea of what you should have done will maybe develop. But I do think on the whole it's mostly just like harmful and unhealthy.
Definitely. There's a difference between regret and learning from past mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. If you're enjoying this episode so far, we'd really appreciate if you consider supporting us. You can go like our page on Facebook or follow us on Instagram or give us a good rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to our podcast. You can find it on pretty much all platforms. Thanks for listening. So how do you think consciousness relates to free will? The idea of free will.
Well, I think to make a decision, you have to be a conscious entity.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard certain definitions of consciousness being, or rather, a definition of what it is to be an entity is that you have the ability to make decisions.
Mm-hmm. But as we've talked about a little bit, your conscious brain becomes aware of the decision and of like the deliberations after the other part of your brain has already made them.
Talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, so there's this. There have been a few experiments on this, but yeah. So one of the most famous ones was called the Libet experiment, after the guy who did it. But it was basically, so there's a dot on like a clock face that's going in a circle, and all they had to do was just make a movement, and then note where the dot was on the screen when they were aware of the intention to move, right? And they found that the conscious awareness of the decision was 200 milliseconds before the actual move. But when they measured the brain state, they could tell that the brain state preceded. They could tell from the brain state what the intention was about 300 milliseconds before that. So like 500 something milliseconds before. And so sometimes even more than that. So there's this delay between when the brain seems to have made the decision and when the person is aware of the decision. And
okay, interesting.
And we have to imagine that, and this was done in like the 80s, I think. We have to imagine that with more and more precise technology, we could probably push that time back even further and make more precise predictions about more complicated things.
Interesting. The issue I have, well, that is a really interesting thing, and the what I don't think it addresses is that. So what this is predicated upon is the notion of a person's sense of self, that the person being tested has a concept of what their self is, and when that ego becomes aware of the decision that's been made, that's when the person consciously makes the decision to move their hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what I think this is
what they're saying is that the awareness of the intention, I mean, precedes the movement by a little bit as well.
The awareness of the intention. Wait, can you say that again in a different way?
So their intention preceded the motion by about 200 milliseconds. So there was a small gap there.
So their intention to move their finger preceded the movement by about 200 milliseconds.
Yeah.
And what was the other part of it?
So, but from the brain readings they were doing, they could see the intention 550 milliseconds before the movement on average. So there's like a 300 millisecond gap, more or less.
Well, how do they define the intention versus the intention, or the awareness of the intention?
So I think that's the whole idea with the clock. Like the person reports where the dot is moving on the circle when they are aware of the intention, and then I guess whoever's doing the experiment can see when they actually do the movement and where the dot is on the clock. So that's like, it's like this intention is self-reported.
Okay, huh? I don't know about that.
Yeah, it's funny because Libet himself said this didn't disprove free will, but a lot of people have pointed to it as disproving it.
Yeah. So, methodological analysis aside, let's assume this signifies what people think it signifies. Still, to me, there's an issue there where the identity is, I think, misplaced. I think this is a situation of misplaced identity, of mistaken identity.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're defining the entity as the whole unit. And we're defining that as like a conscious being. But I think that the conscious being is in some ways much more than what we think it is.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we sort of have these constructs in our mind of who we are, and that construct is almost invariably incorrect or imperfect. There's always so much more to your existence than you are aware of.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
And furthermore, well, I would even go so far as to say that it's like this bulwark. Your ego is like a bulwark in this vast sea of existence, and that the sea is you. You're not the bulwark.
Mm-hmm. I have to look up or what's the definition of bulwark exactly?
Like okay, think about like a wall or a fortress or something.
Mm-hmm.
And you have these impulses that seem to arise from out there, but really out there is just a part of you that you're failing to recognize is a part of yourself.
Yeah, totally. Like you're not really located behind your eyes.
Yeah,
and I would say you're. And we talked about this. You are everything that you're sensing is how I would think of it.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard that there's actually a great amount of neural tissue in your stomach area?
Yeah, you have. It's called like the ganglia or something. Ganglion.
Something kinky like that.
Yeah, but yeah. There's a bunch of stuff like that we don't really know whether it's conscious or not, and we don't really know whether there are like islands of consciousness in our brain that are different from us, from our thing that we perceive as ourself.
Mm-hmm. And I would say there's gotta be all over the place.
Yeah,
but also what I heard anyway, which I can't cite this, but that your neurons in your stomach area react to stimulus before and without the knowledge of your your head brain. It's kind of like a the phrase gut reaction. It's your impulse to move that saves you from the tiger.
Right.
You don't have time to ponder the philosophical implications of it. You just have to move right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, it would kind of make sense in such a system that that the awareness of the action should happen later than the action.
Mm-hmm. And you don't think that has any bearing on the idea of free will?
No, because I think at the same time, by making that action, the gut neurons or whatever part of your brain that is separate from your awareness of yourself, by making that decision to act, it is demonstrating consciousness.
I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, we don't really know which part of the brain is making the decision and which is the conscious part, because we don't understand consciousness.
Maybe I'll use a different word than consciousness, because that's a nebulous word.
Mm.
It's demonstrating free will. Just not any less nebulous.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for most people, for something for them to consider something to be free will, it has to originate from the conscious part of their brain.
Mm-hmm. Well, this ties into a previous discussion we had that maybe there is no such thing as a not conscious part of your brain. Remember we were talking about the loops, and that each loop, no matter how small a loop, is still an identity or an entity, and that entity is capable of awareness.
Yeah, and that it all kind of builds up from these smaller pieces.
Exactly.
Yeah. Or if panpsychism is true, then everything is conscious. But
mm-hmm.
Yeah, it could be a lot messier than that. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
Every loop in your brain could be conscious, right? Yeah, and if that's true, then every loop is involved in making the decision. Then consciousness and the decision making could be interlinked.
And this also ties back into, from that same discussion, that existence is rooted in perception, and if you are able to perceive certain stimuli and then act, those parts of yourself that have acted are making a decision based on perception. So if I perceive, therefore I am is true, then you kind of have to recognize them as being conscious entities.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to think about how who I think I am is kind of an illusion. It's really a composite created by all these smaller entities that work together toward their own goals and collaborate to create this sort of colony of different entities. And all of those together creates the ego perception of me as a singular entity.
Right. And it's also true that you're not necessarily continuous from moment to moment. You're kind of you have the memories from your past, but each present moment you're kind of distinct and separate in a way.
Yes.
And the continuity isn't necessarily there.
Yeah. So touching back again on my first acid trip. This is something I learned from that. This perception of my existence in the present moment as being a whole reality, an eternity. And then there was another one, and then there was another one. And so because of this, realizing that who I am over the course of time is not one singular person, but as you're saying, each individual moment is a distinct version of me. It's a different person, a different entity.
Right. So given all this stuff that we're talking about with brains and free will, what do you think the implications are for moral responsibility?
Well, I think that there absolutely is moral responsibility for each person, because whether you recognize it or not, you have the ability to make decisions, and those decisions have outcomes.
Right. So your actions have consequences, but I think the question is whether it makes sense to assign praise or blame to actions and people, and whether it's useful or to what degree, that kind of thing.
I think it can be useful if it's done in a way that can be learned from.
Yeah. I think I agree, and it's hard to not do that just as humans, but yeah, I think we just have to be careful.
Yeah, you're right. It can absolutely be destructive if it gets out of hand.
Yeah.
I know people. I know of one person in particular who I will not name, who likes to play the blame game. Whenever anything goes wrong, it's always who's to blame, what went wrong, and who can we cast blame on. And it's never that it just happened that way. It's never a weird amalgam of instances that made this happen. It's always, who can I blame? This is not fun.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard not to blame yourself, especially, even though that I think for me, I always try to have that be the positive takeaway from the whole free will discussion.
Yeah.
Is that I should be like very, very gentle with myself.
Absolutely. There's nothing to be gained from stewing in self-guilt and self-reproach.
Yeah.
It's kind of self-indulgent even. In fact, you should be ashamed if you're doing that.
Yeah, it can get into kind of like a masochistic spiral.
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting. So this is a very kind of esoteric, arcane subject, and that is maybe kind of a semantic bullshit going back and forth, and yet by talking about it, we come to these valuable takeaways that maybe don't necessarily speak to the core of the question, but are important life lessons.
Definitely. I mean, it can also go the other way, like knowing that you don't really have control over something like your work ethic or your ability to pay attention or that kind of. I mean, like you can change it, but you're gonna have a certain range of capacity.
Definitely. At the same time, I think a lot of the time people are looking for instant gratification, and they don't realize that it takes time to build those things. You can absolutely have drastic changes to your personality, your work ethic, your ability to focus, but it takes concerted effort over a long period of time. It's something that you have to build up slowly. It's not just going to happen in a day.
Yeah, definitely.
At the same time, now I'm gonna, I don't know, I hope I'm not contradicting myself now. So I'll tell you a little story about myself. I grew up with my granddad in the household because he moved in when I was 10, because he was going senile. He couldn't remember 3 minutes ago when I was 10. By the time I was 20, he couldn't remember 30 seconds ago, and he would often have fits of forgetting who or when he was. I remember one time he was talking to me and it sounded like he was maybe back in the Navy. He thought he was speaking to, I don't even, I don't know where he was, but just having this presence as a major part of my life. He'd tell the same stories that were kind of comical over and over and over again about his life. Make the same joke every single morning. So having this presence in my life was highly influential. In one part, because it taught me to be patient with people, but in another more relevant sense, I realized that I did not want to be like that. I never wanted to lose my mind in that way. In fact, it was kind of my biggest fear at one point. So much so that I remember a particular instance where I made the decision that I wouldn't let myself become that way. I remember making this decision spontaneously as I was standing in the living room next to one of my dad's drums that he had standing there. I think I was going out the door to church with my mom, and standing there just having a moment of clarity and saying, I'm not going to lose my mind that way. And it was in that instant that I began, I think, to think critically and to examine my existence, and sort of started me off on this snowball of thinking and developing a clarity of thought that I didn't possess before.
Wow. Is that something that you can actually like change through effort?
From my own personal perception of what that, for lack of a better word, energy is, of being in that mindset, and with my own experiences of developing critical thought and clarity, I think it's absolutely something you can change. And of course, yeah, there are certainly limitations. There are probably ways that I could still be put on that path for sure, or taken off it, I suppose. But yeah, I absolutely feel that is something that you can influence.
Yeah, I think, and probably like the earlier you start, the better your chances are.
Yeah, that was when I was in high school, so I had a lot more brain plasticity then.
Yeah.
Still,
do you do puzzles and stuff? Like logic puzzles and that kind of thing?
I did more esoteric and abstract than that. I just began to think about everything, every single assumption that I had made, every awareness that I picked up. I would make that into a thought puzzle and say, why is that? What's going on here? And I had the impression of, at first it was like all these little minor epiphanies, like, oh, I get it. Haha, that's great. And then those sort of would coalesce into these like little tiny islands of knowledge things that like, oh, I thought about that. That's a thing that I know now. And of course, a lot of it was like completely arrogant, self-absorbed high schooler who thinks he knows everything. But but eventually those islands started to coalesce together into greater and greater chunks. And before long, I felt like I had a framework by which I could look at the world and understand it.
Wow. Yeah, it's super. I think that's super unusual path to take.
I'm an unusual
that kind
person.
of thing. You're special boy. Yeah, I'd love to see a study on how that kind of thing changes the brain as opposed to the more logic, puzzle oriented type stuff that people always talk about as being useful for like dementia prevention.
Yeah. I think there's a direct corollary we can draw between that and musical practice. So obviously the more you practice, the better you get at the instrument, right? But there's different ways you can practice, and some are more efficient than others.
Right.
So, for example, I've people will say that I think there's some sort of study out there, which I know I shouldn't say there's a study somewhere, but as far as my understanding goes, if you focus on a particular unit of, like, I don't know, a bar or a chord or whatever it is that you're working on, focus specifically on that small unit for a period of maybe 2 minutes, and then move on to something completely different and just cycle through everything that way, that's more efficient than if you were to sit down for 10 minutes on each minute thing and really hammer it out.
Yeah, 'cause I think you need to practice what it's like to feel like you have something down, and then go try to do something else, and then come back to the first thing.
Yeah.
And have it kind of have fallen out of whack, and then you like relearn it, and it's faster the second time.
Totally.
And that it just kind of keeps reinforcing itself. Yeah, totally.
And also that every musician knows that the least effective way to practice is just to take your piece, start at the beginning, play to the end, repeat.
Yeah.
Better to break it down into the smaller units and find the pain points, right?
Yeah.
But for me, when I practice, can get into this flow state where the way I jump around between things that I'm focusing on is really, it feels organic to me. It's not like a thought out structure where I said, okay, I'm going to spend 2 minutes on this bar and then 2 minutes on this. It's kind of like, it feels like I've learned to surf my awareness and say, or my attention, surf my attention, so that the moment my attention wants to flit to something else, I let it flit to something else. And to me, this has been an incredibly effective and efficient way to learn music.
That's really interesting. So when you say flit to anything else, you mean like in the music, or just
within the music?
Yeah.
Although, if your mind keeps flitting away from the music, then maybe that's a sign that you should get up and take a walk or something.
Yeah.
Eat a snack.
Yeah.
But so the reason I brought that up is that I think that sort of organic following your attention method maybe maps to my esoteric following of just analysis of thought spontaneously and constantly, and like a structured like practice schedule where each bar is measured out to a certain number of minutes would maybe relate to like particular puzzles designed to fight off dementia.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know music itself, music is supposed to be a good preventative measure for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah, so as long as we're on the topic of music, I think it's really interesting to think about how the idea of free will relates to improvisation.
Ooh, yeah, that's an interesting one.
Because I think most people would think that improvisation, especially like free improvisation, is almost as close as you can get to something like free will.
Mm.
Like, because it seems so like the possibilities are so limitless.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, if you examine it closely enough, I mean, you're almost never creating something completely new, right? You're synthesizing
Yeah.
what you've already learned in creative ways,
Mm.
and that's
Yeah.
but yeah, it is really interesting to think about it, and it's beautiful to me that when you play a solo, like every note in that solo was like predetermined in some way.
Mm.
Like, it's just kind of beautiful, like the specificity of the universe just like includes the specific notes of that solo.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And it makes me think about, there's this, back and forth. Is there free will? Is there not free will? And despite all that we've hammered out and all the different ways to look at it, it makes me kind of wonder if this is one of those things that's just both of the opposites are true at the same time.
What do you mean by that?
Maybe there is free will and there is not free will, and that is a meaningful truth, despite being an apparent contradiction.
Yeah, I mean, is that, would you say that's the same as saying that the concept of free will doesn't really make sense?
I mean, you could look at it that way, but I think you don't have to, because it's the nature of how paradoxes that exist in a finite number of dimensions that appear to be self-contradictory. When you add a higher number of dimensions, it simplifies into a self-consistent scenario.
Huh. Not sure I quite understand that.
This is an idea I learned from Michio Kaku in his Parallel Worlds and his hyperspace books. When you have a paradox, you can resolve that paradox by adding an extra dimension, so that on the lower dimension it appears to be a contradiction, and therefore could be considered a meaningless concept. But when you add in that extra dimension, it becomes a meaningful concept, or self-consistent.
So what would the extra dimension be in the free will case?
I don't know. I could not tell you. But just to recognize. Oh, yeah, maybe I can tell you. And I've brought this up before, and you called it poetic. But maybe when we take time into consideration, it can resolve how there can be, in this present moment, both free will and not free will. And the way I would reconcile those two things is to put free will as the purview of the future, right? Anything could happen, limitless possibility, and determinism as the purview of the past, which seems to be self-consistent and which cannot be changed. Now, when you have the future meeting the past, that is the present, right?
Yeah, I guess but the future being undetermined depends on whether quantum mechanics, or like whether determinism is true, or whether the indeterminism of quantum mechanics is is ultimately what determines what happens.
Yes, which, while I know that there could be, I know that the jury's still out, but for me, it seems kind of necessary to take the view that the quantum mechanic interpretation is valid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would lean towards that as well, but
who knows? Everything could have possibly been decided. I don't necessarily believe that it's possible that everything was decided at the beginning of whatever, and now we're just playing it all out. I don't know if I can defend that, except to say that by the fact of our existence in the present that we can perceive, that implies the ability to make decisions, as we've talked about, and therefore influence the future. And so that if there were not a perception of the present moment, then that could be a place where there would be no free will, where there would be determinism. But if you have that perception of a present, of an identity, of a self, that necessarily leaves the space for decisions to be made, and therefore to affect alternate outcomes of the future.
Mm-hmm. I feel like we're circling back to kind of where we started and decided we agreed, but I don't know if we actually agree anymore.
Oh no.
Yeah, I mean, again, if indeterminism is true, then sure, like what you perceive is not a definite thing, and then you're gonna act differently based on the different perceptions. But the like you're not controlling the things that you perceive. They're being randomly generated.
Yeah.
Which I wouldn't call free will.
Sure. And then we're getting back into the semantics about free will, but just to say that you have volition to make a decision in the present moment. And I think that by having a perception of the present moment, that necessarily includes the volition of being able to make a decision one way or the other.
I don't think that's true, because you could imagine, well, what if there's some brain that doesn't have any access to like any appendages or whatever, and can only like perceive through its eyes, and it has a decision about whether to pick up a cup or not.
I don't think that's a meaningful situation. I don't think it can have that decision if it has no means to pick up the cup.
Maybe so, but it kind of gets to that your actions are very, very limited from the outset.
Sure,
by your present situation.
And again, I believe that to have an experience of existing in the present, there must necessarily be an aspect of infinity and an aspect of the finite. And so, yeah, there absolutely are ways in which you are limited, but also ways in which you are not.
Yeah, I still don't think it's necessary to have volition for perception.
I think we differ there. Why?
Because like I said, you could have a brain that can take no action other than thinking of things, and it can just perceive, and you could consider thinking of things as choosing whether to think of one thing or another as volition.
I would definitely.
Yeah, and I guess it depends what you mean by perception, but I could imagine that you could have an intelligent system that's conscious and can perceive, but can't have volition. That's conjecture, but I just don't see what would prevent that.
Interesting. Maybe that's a proof that I need to build up still, but for some reason I see that as being a necessity.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Like I could see how that would be true, but I don't think it's necessarily true.
Well, maybe I'll think about that and get back to you.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Yeah. Sorry, guys. You don't get to know the nature of existence.
This will be on our OnlyFans.
What?
Do you know what OnlyFans is? It's I actually don't really know how to describe it exactly, but it's kind of like risque content or whatever that like people like, yeah, you have to like pay for it, and then people will put kind of, you know, racy stuff, or like I don't even really I've never been on it.
And why do you know what it is, Trevor?
It's a meme. That's why.
Yes, clearly.
Yeah. Closing thoughts?
Yeah. Man, I think this has been a pretty scattered discussion tonight, but maybe that's just the nature of the subject that is really kind of hard to talk about, and this has been a point of contention between us, where we have very different interpretations of the language, and I think very different things that we think about when we think about the concept of free will.
Yeah. I gotta say, it was a lot less contentious than I thought it was gonna be.
Ended up agreeing on most things.
Yeah. I was prepared with like a long list of like different like philosophers and stuff. Didn't even need to dip into it. Yeah, as much as people will debate whether this is even a thing that's worth talking about, I think it is.
Yeah.
Because like you said, it can lead you to some valuable takeaways and valuable ways to look at life and how to live it, and that whole thing. And yeah, I think ultimately just more compassion for people if you acknowledge that they didn't choose the way they are.
Yeah, definitely.
Even if they're being shitty.
Yeah, what's that quote from The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss? There's like a really unpleasant character, and then the kid's like, fuck that guy, and then the dad's like, hey, don't be mad at him. You only have to deal with his unpleasant self for today. He has to deal with it every day of his life.
Yep. Yeah, and unpleasant people are most likely suffering in some way.
Definitely.
All the time, or just in that moment. Could just be like a bad day.
Yeah, I think it's really valuable to be able to look at that and to see that morality isn't nearly so cut and dry as we laid out in our hypothetical scenarios tonight.
Yeah.
Clearly you would optimize for the best world state for everyone. Who else would ever not?
Everyone is Jesus.
Yes. We are all sons of God. Yeah, well. I don't know how to tie that together.
Yeah, I'm just glad we were able to reach so much agreement.
Yeah, me too.
It was cool.
Definitely.
Yeah. Again, it's unexpected.
You've definitely encouraged me to think about this and expand my perspective since we first started talking about it.
It's good. Because I feel like this is one of those things where not a lot of people change their mind once they decide what they think, except over maybe very long periods of time.
Yeah, I think one of the most valuable things about being able to discourse and have discussions is the ability to change your mind and grow. Otherwise, you're just flinging shit back and forth. Remember one time I was talking with my dad when I was a kid, and we were going back and forth, and eventually he made his point, and I realized that he was right, and I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I see, you're right. And then he was like, oh, what did you say? You're right? Oh, yeah. Oh, wow, I'm so lucky. So many people would be so jealous to hear that their son said, you're right.
How old were you?
I don't know, 10, 12,
10.
14, who knows?
I'm glad he got that satisfaction at least once.
Well, it kind of annoyed me at the time because I was thinking, like, well, what's the point of this if you're not, if one of us isn't going to say you're right at the end of it? Like,
so young, so naive,
so innocent and true, and like I believe that still to today.
Yeah.
What's the point if you're not willing to say you're right?
Yeah. Although, I mean, if you really believe that if you talk to the other person long enough that they would say they're right, then, or they would say you're right, then that would be a reason not to say you're right.
Well, I mean, I definitely wouldn't say to say you're right if you don't believe it, but it's more just that you go into the discussion with the ability to recognize when a point has been well made and when that point is contradictory to your own, that it becomes a truth that you have to accept, even if it changes your look on the world.
Yeah, you have to be at least willing to get to that point, hypothetically.
Definitely. Well, thank you for discoursing with me.
Oh, the discourse was a pleasure.